Hello, everyone. Welcome to MRC Virtual. My name is Parul Sharma, and we'll be talking about achieving equilibrium, risk, and customer experience. So, before I go into the topic and before I introduce my awesome partner, I wanted to spend a few seconds to talk about why we chose this topic. So, when Jen and myself were talking about which topic should we pick, the first topic that came to our mind was crystal ball communications. And then we realized, there is no crystal ball. And to be very honest, our customers are very predictable. So if you think about it, our customers mostly want four things. They want speed, personalization, convenience, and security. I call it SPCS. We won't talk about security in this session. We'll talk about speed, personalization, and convenience. So these are the three things that our customers ever wanted. Yes, pandemic happened. Yes, things changed. But if you really think about it, all the things that happened were expected. We grew digitally, consumer behavior changed a lot, but it was not unexpected. It was something that we were expecting. Things just expedited because of the pandemic. So, going back to the same point, our customers have shown consistent expectations from us around speed, personalization, and convenience. It's a little hard for us because, these are different levers. If you think about it, faster transactions. So, speed is one lever. The other lever could be fraud. The third lever could be customer experience. The fourth lever could be, uh, it could be customer retention or fixing card abandonment. So there are many, many levers, but all those levers fall into the three categories. Either we are trying to make it convenient for our customers, or we are trying to give them a personalized experience, or we are trying to give them things faster and accurately. So bringing all these things together, it is very important for us as a merchant or us as a vendor to talk about how do we achieve this equilibrium? How do we pull these different levers from fraud to customer experience? And can we really pull all these levers together? So the answer is no. There's always a trade-off. And this is where Jen and myself, we decided we'll talk about how do we enable other merchants or share our best practices around achieving equilibrium between risk and customer experience. So, as I said, I'll take a few minutes to introduce the topic and then I'll get out of your way so that Jen can introduce herself. Over to you, Jen.
Awesome. Thanks, Parul. So happy to be here. Not sure where everybody is dialed in from. So good morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you are. I'm happy to be co-leading the session with Parul for the second time in hopes to reach more of my peers across the industry. Just to introduce myself, I'm Jennifer Owen. I've been in the risk and payments industry for over 20 years now, spending the last 3.5 at Meta. For those of you who haven't learned the new name yet, we were previously known as Facebook. When Pearl approached me about the session topic, I was motivated to join hands and share with all of you what took me years to realize in my own journey in risk management, and so now foundationally important to me in every job that I've taken on since. It's allowed me to shift from constant reactive firefighting and feeling blindsided to having a greater sense of awareness and readiness to deal with what was to come. If you're tuned in, I hope that you find the session relatable and meaningful. Thank you for listening. And with that, I will turn it back over to Parul.
Thank you. So, I work for LexisNexis Risk Solutions and I've been with the company for over 7 years now. My job is to work with merchants like yourself to help you build risk based workflows. So, as I said, I work with merchants to make sure that they are consciously pulling the levers that they want to pull. We don't want fraudsters and to decide how those levers look like. But as Jen just mentioned, the objective is to get proactive and not be reactive. So we don't want external factors, including fraudsters, to determine which level are we pulling. So this is exactly where my role comes into picture. I not only work with merchants, but I also work with other industries. But my job is pretty much the same to help our customers build risk-based workflows. Now, what is a risk-based workflow? So before we really go into there, if you think of risk and customer experience, they're two sides of the same coin. Both of them are really important. As a merchant, I'm assuming that you want zero risk and 100% frictionless customer experience. But is it possible? I don't think, in my humble opinion, I don't think that's possible. And this is exactly where we want to talk about what can we do consciously to choose our risk to friction ratio, to decide in that moment proactively, not reactively, that, hey, this is what is needed for our business, and these are the things that needs to be done for us to achieve our business goals. But the question is, how do we really define the right balance? And before we answer that question, let's talk a little bit more about fraud and customer experience. Fraud is expensive. There are many merchants who want to write off fraud, and some of them do write off fraud. But when fraud becomes expensive and fraud becomes too much, sometimes it cannot be written off. And on the screen, you can see some statistics. Every $1 of fraud now costs US retail and e commerce merchants about $3.6, which is 15% higher than what it was in 2019. It was 3.13 and now it's 3.6. So for every $1 that you're losing, you're actually not losing $1, you're losing more than three times money. And that's why fraud is expensive. And in most of the cases, it's not easy to write off that kind of cost. But if you look at customer experience, as I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, that increase in the digital increase in the digital transactions, in changes in the behavior. I mean, imagine my grandmother now interacting digitally to buy certain things. Yes, pandemic forced her to do what she's doing now, but then the fact that we were expecting the economy to grow digitally was expected, and it just expedited. So if you look at just the number of transactions that has changed in a past a few years, especially during pandemic, the increase in the good customer transactions during pandemic has outpaced fraud rate growth. So what that means is, yes, fraud is expensive, but we have many, many, many good transactions that we have to worry about. This is why it becomes very difficult for us to balance these two levers, but this doesn't mean that we cannot balance them. So before we really get into the process, I wanted to share one quick statistics which is specific to e-commerce. Now, if you look at the chart here, and if you look at the numbers of the US cost of fraud and focus specific to e-commerce, you will see that e-commerce saw a 34.4% increase in the cost of fraud and also a 140% increase in the volume of the attacks since the pre to early COVID-19 period. So this means fraud is expensive and there are more attacks, but the increase in the good transactions have outpaced the fraud. Now, with those statistics and numbers in mind, let's talk about the stages of a
Pessoal,
fraudster's journey.
eu achei que a gente
Awesome.
tinha
So I'll
intervalo,
spend the
mas
next
tinha
two
esse
slides
intervalo eles
kind of
marcaram como se fosse
giving
1 minuto,
you what I think have
tá?
become the critical tools to
É,
really start to
aí a
attack
segunda
and
parte agora vai
reduce the
ser à
cost of
noite.
fraud. We'll always deal with
Eu tô
fraud.
olhando
We'll never
aqui,
be fully prepared.
volta às
Everybody
7
says
horas da
we want to
noite.
be, 3 steps ahead.
Quem
But fraudsters, let's
não
face
quiser
it, are
assistir porque tá muito
heavily
tarde
funded
ou qualquer
by
coisa, não
the
sei se vocês
schemes
estão
and things that they pull,
aqui,
and so it's really tough
tá
to do
bom?
that.
Eu não sei
But
se
I do
vocês estão
think
aí,
there
não
are
sei
ways
se
to work
colaborar
smarter
rapidinho.
and really try to impact the bottom line. So this first
Ah, tá.
slide talks
Então,
about
lá no
the
link que eu
three
mandei pra vocês tem a
stages of a
agenda.
fraudster's
Então,
journey.
tem aqui
Before
os
I talk a
eventos,
little bit
tal.
about the context of what those three
Eu não tinha
stages
reparado
are, I would like
que
to have everybody
eles
just
tinham
take a
colocado
moment and
intervalo
ask yourself these
numa,
questions as I'm
no
reading them
evento,
off to you.
tá bom?
Can I say with
É,
confidence
e aí
that
o
I know
evento
our
tá
products and have
previsto para
detailed,
voltar às
documented
7
end-to-end flows,
e vai
and
ir
including
até
knowledge of what
às
policy
9
settings
horas.
exist and
O
risk
que que eu tô
mitigation
fazendo, tá?
capabilities that are available
Eu
to
tô
me when things
gravando.
happen?
Em alguns momentos tem
Do I
eventos que acontecem ao
understand the
mesmo tempo.
risks
A gente tem tipo
associated
hoje,
with
por
each
exemplo, que
step
é
in the flow?
10h15.
And
Tinha esses
lastly,
dois,
do
a
I
gente
have
assistiu o primeiro.
monitoring and control
Às
reports to
10h55 tinha
proactively
esses
be alerted
dois.
when activity in any of these
A gente
steps becomes
assistiu
of question?
o primeiro também.
In other words, are you ready for the
Mas
next
eu tô
fraud attack
aproveitando que eu tô
or
conseguindo
system
acessar
failure
os outros
that
e
can
eu tô
have
gravando
major
desde o outro
impact to your
computador, tá?
company's lost budget
Então,
or brand trust?
eu vou
This
compartilhar
first
o
slide
link com todos os
illustrates the
eventos
three
para vocês.
stages that are critical to the success of any bad actor. The
Falou,
first
gente.
one,
Bom almoço. Fica com
enabling
Deus aí.
control of the account. For first
Tchau.
party, this is achieved through successful creation of a new account on your platform. For third party, or also known as account takeover, This is achieved through obtaining the login credentials to gain access to an existing account, maybe attack you through a man-in-the-middle browser attack, or gain access through social engineering your support flows. Further, for third-party fraud, bad actors will secure the control gained by often changing the current password, phone number, and email to maintain that as long as they possibly can without being detected. The second piece or stage is, once they're in, now understanding the value of the account and what abuses or fraud acts can be carried out. Is there a saved payment method on file? Can I successfully add a stolen payment instrument and pass any authentication or verification that might be triggered? And then there's stage 3, achieving monetization, which we all know is the ultimate goal. The ability to exit funds to an instrument the bad actor has control over, or receive digital or physical goods by controlling the final destination of where it is sent. These 3 stages should be heavily considered when building out a more detailed customer user journey mapping that I'll talk about on the next slide. In this example, I took a very high-level example of a customer user journey map and what that might look like. Hopefully many of you can relate to it, although you may have multiple products offered at your company. It also shows a rough assessment of which steps can often lead to a fraudster taking control of an account or where they can likely achieve monetization. Keeping in mind that these detailed flows are not only useful for fraud and abuse, but also gaining an understanding of the general health of your technical systems and dependencies, which is not illustrated in this particular mapping. I'll walk you through a few of the steps in the user journey to give you a sense of some of the questions that you want to ask yourself or of your organization, which ties back to some of my previous questions from the prior slide. Do you know what policy settings and controls are in place, or where you have blind spots and need to close those gaps? If I take login, for example, which can be a risk of enabling access to an account, questions that you might want to ask yourself is, how many attempts does each user have to enter the user ID and password combination? At what point does it reset if there's a maximum limit? Is it daily? Is it on a per session basis? And what happens when the user reaches the max number of attempts? Do you intervene at a human level? Do you block the user temporarily and ask them to come back later? It's important to know these inputs. Do I have the ability to understand how many accounts share the same password via a tokenized value? None of us typically have access to raw password information, but if you have the ability to tokenize and set a single standard for a unique password, being able to look across and identify accounts that are sharing passwords and further evaluating whether they make sense to be related to each other or not. What measurements do I have in place to monitor the number of login attempts on a daily or hourly basis? And am I ready if there's a spike in this behavior on a single account or across multiple accounts? And do I have the real-time capabilities to assess the risk of those logins, or if they've started through forgot password flows, at a minimum, maybe even just feeding the signals downstream into other areas where maybe you do have capabilities to mitigate any upcoming risks. If I take change credit card, for example, other questions that may look different from login: how many active cards do you allow per account? How many accounts can share the same payment method on file across your entire network? What does this enable in terms of risk, and how important is it to allow a bad actor to monetize? What measurements do I have in place to confirm these policy settings or thresholds are working as designed? Is the value that is set for each of these settings enabling fraud, or is it too limiting even maybe for my good users? And how often are active payment methods on file changing across my entire network on a daily and maybe hourly basis? And what do I do if I see a spike in this behavior? And again, the same question applies to login. Do I have any real-time capabilities to assess the risk and or intervene with an end user to mitigate any potential risks I'm seeing at this particular point in the flow? Maybe step-up authentication can be invoked. Maybe you block any further activity, or you cancel the pending transaction that maybe is at play. or you're gathering behavioral signals and comparing that against the good user's normal patterns or bad user patterns. And then I mentioned a little bit about technical failures and things that you should also be looking at there. While it's not illustrated, those are questions that should also be threaded through as you build out your customer user journey mapping in quite amount of detail. One being refunds. Do I know when a refund fails and money doesn't actually move from your company to your user versus waiting for that user to escalate? Where's my money? Do you have negative lists that you maintain? And if you were to send 100 payment instruments to be added to that negative list, how do you have confidence that those 100 instruments were recorded in that backend table? If you have rule systems that are executing different rules with corresponding actions, do I know when a rule does not execute and enforce the expected action? Maybe the system timed out. In any case, the important point is that everyone should have these mappings for your organization. What does this look like for your organization? It may look completely different. And have you asked all of the right questions to assess the risk and ensure you have the right monitoring and reporting in place? Assuming you're ahead and you've done the work and you know your product and the customer user journey in detail, how do you actually now manage the user experience and balance the friction that you may bring into the process? I'll hand it back to Parul to chat a little bit about accuracy and why it matters.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. So I just wanted to make sure that I communicate a very important point here. When we were at MRC, there were a lot of discussions on this customer journey. So if you have any questions, if you want to discuss anything, Jen has already given us a lot of great points. But if you want her to specifically delve on a specific point or maybe talk about other points, I just want you to know that we have a chat window open. And if you want, you can submit your questions in the chat window, and we'll be happy to discuss using the chat window the questions that you have. And before I move on to the accuracy slide, I just wanted you to know this journey is mapped out. That's when it's important for us to understand what is the optimal risk to friction ratio for every use case, for every touch point, for every endpoint, for every channel. And that risk to friction ratio could be different depending on whether the user is just browsing through or whether the user is on the payment use case where they're trying to digitally transact and where there is a potential of monetizing. So this is exactly why the whole journey is important, because you cannot look at the risk to friction ratio in a silo. You have to figure out what matters to you and what is it that you need to get to a specific decision in order to pull the levers that I mentioned a few minutes back. So most of us, what we are doing is we are chasing accuracy. And coming from the vendor side, I know all of our customers, they want two things from us. They want us to be accurate and they want us to be faster. So speed and accuracy is what our customers want from us. But then when it comes to accuracy, there is a cost of chasing accuracy, but there's also a cost of not being accurate. So let's talk about the impact of making a decision with lack of accuracy, and pick any use case that you want to. You can pick an instant where you are accepting. So you want to be accurate while accepting orders because you want to accept more orders. And as I said, ideally we want to accept all the orders. We want to deny 0 orders, and we want to be 100% accurate about accepting, which basically means we don't want any fraud. That's an ideal situation, but we don't live in an ideal world. So this is why it's important for us to look at these different elements, meaning when it comes to accepting orders, what's the cost of being wrong? If I'm accepting a bad order, then it's going to be expensive because that could be a fraudster, and the fraudster is basically monetized. But if I'm not accepting a good order, then that has a different kind of cost. It might impact your customer satisfaction. It might impact your retention. It might impact your customer acquisition. So whether you look at accepting more orders or whether you look at denying more orders, you want to deny, as I said, you want to deny the orders accurately, meaning you only want to deny the orders which are bad, and you want to do it faster because you don't want to waste your time and you don't want to create bad customer experience for your customers. But then there is a cost of being not accurate when you are denying orders. Similarly, if you look at challenge and chargeback, the same concept applies. there is the cost associated with us being inaccurate about challenging orders or even about chargebacks. But as I said, while lack of accuracy has a cost, accuracy also has a cost associated with it. And at the end of the day, it goes back to what Jen was talking about. If we understand our world better, if we know what we are monitoring, if we know what the gaps are, if we know what we need to do, if we know what changes are we planning to make, if we know what will be the impact of those changes, then we can make a conscious choice of whether we are willing to pay the price associated with being inaccurate or whether we are willing to pay the price of being accurate. So, what do I mean when I say chasing accuracy comes with a cost? So, it really depends on what kind of business you are in. For example, some of our customers, they have digital orders, which means they want to do the fraud checks fast because they have to deliver a digital good. So, which means that there is a chance that they're probably looking at multiple different aspects of the transactions asynchronously to get to the decision faster. But that might mean that they are spending more money because they're probably running a test, a check on the phone or on the email or on other things, and they're doing it fast and they're doing all the fraud checks because for them, time is of essence. It's a digital good, it'll be delivered right away. So in this specific case, it's more money. Similarly, it could be time to decision, meaning I don't want to spend a lot of money. I'll take my own sweet time. I want to be accurate, which means I'll run one check depending on whether it's successful or not, or the insights that it gives me. I'm going to run another check and then another check till I'm confident it's a good or a bad user. So it's taking you longer to make that decision. And there's a cost with, that time to decision being longer. Similarly, speed to cash. Okay, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm going to sit on it and I'm going to do whatever needs to be done, which means it will take you more time to get to the cash. So, depending on what you're doing, the kind of business that you are in, and the poison that you are willing to pick, you will have to figure out the risk to friction ratio, but you cannot do it unless you have a complete 360-degree view of the customer journey as of today and the customer journey that you are aspiring for. This is when you understand the gaps and then you consciously make a choice of how much how much friction you want to create for your customers. And this is where, Jen, I would like to request you to share more best practices from a merchant perspective.
Absolutely. So I'm going to tie kind of some of what Parul already covered and some of the things I covered on the previous slides on the user journey mapping and just go a little bit deeper. Because I think on the surface, it's, great. Where do I start? You've given me some idea of questions to ask, but how do I really pull it together? And so I'll just kind of walk through each of these bullet points. So as I mentioned, knowing your product, partner with the right point of contacts across your company to create a detailed end-to-end flow of your products. The flow should capture all your user-facing touch points, all of your support entry points, and understand the different channels that you might have enabled. Do you support email, chat, phone, or all three? The policies that help protect certain features that are available to your users, your risk mitigation, and any identity capabilities that you might have and can be pulled at any one of those points in the flow. And in order to monitor things, data logging is super critical to also assess this as you build out your end-to-end flows. Understanding what data is logged at each step in the flow and work to close any gaps that you may identify. For example, I worked at a prior company where we were logging all of our, email address changes, but unfortunately, each time an account changed an email address individually, we overrode the current value with the new email address and the date of the last change, but we did not keep the historical information for that particular user account. And so making sure that you have the right level and granularity of data being logged at each of these steps, whether you want to feed that into some monitoring and control reports or feed that into detection capabilities, data is critical to all of that, to enabling and making all that come to life. If you're consuming data from an external API, for example, make sure your product team is mapping the result to an internal reference that you both log the value from the external API and your internal mapping. So, for example, product may consolidate, several issuer decline codes on a payment to a singular internal response code. making sure that your product team also captures the raw data, not just the singular internal response code, because it will limit you when it comes time to do an analysis to really understand what are the signals and factors that you need to consider when you are seeing something new on your systems. Understanding key risks and defining your risk tolerance, making sure that you do a risk assessment on each user-facing touch point to understand how one might abuse the flow to take control of the account or monetize, creating a financial loss or brand reputational risk for your organization. Act accordingly. Create monitoring and control reports to avoid being blindsided by new fraud attack vectors, forms of abuse, or systemic failures. Making sure in parallel that you're establishing a baseline based on what you believe is an acceptable level of activity for each step in the flow. I mentioned previously looking at maybe daily or hourly, depending on the flow and magnitude of traffic on any one touch point in your system, and making sure that you have enough granularity to that information to be able to spot when things may be going in a wrong direction. Create an alert mechanism to quickly steer your attention to activity that is above or below your baselines and are not expected behaviors. And I say alerts, not everybody has access to them, but if you do this well, you'll find that you need much more monitoring and alerting than maybe you have manual manpower to look at. And so creating an alert mechanism when possible is really important to allow you to quickly hone in onto those issues. Enabling skills, individuals who could quickly triage and investigate any alerts that are triggered. This is where you might have, agents who are skilled at certain levels to review the activity in question and quickly triage and make sense of it. Maybe, they'll find there was some marketing event, and so seeing a jump in your, dollars that were authorized on the site may not be a big event if you knew some of the behind the scene things that were intentionally happening, versus in other instances, it may be an indicator that fraud is on the rise and you're being attacked. Act accordingly, of course, and adjust policies or leverage existing risk mitigation capabilities wherever they're available. Integrate new capabilities as appropriate as you identify gaps in your process and abilities to mitigate things. And create experiences that will build trust and ease the process to recover their account or fraudulent payment when fraud has occurred. And lastly, adjust regularly. Revisit all of the above as fraud patterns and associated costs evolve in your business. I will turn it back now to Parul to cover our next topic here.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. So at the end of the day, one size doesn't fit all. So the recommendation that I wanted to make here was most of our successful customers, they follow a multi-layered approach because one size is not going to fit all. So pick the multi-layered approach where there are multiple different layers. So as Jen at some point mentioned, you might be stepping up your users, or you might be OTPing your users, but you don't have to OTP every one of them. You only would like to OTP maybe the users which are high risk, or maybe the products which are high value, where you want to dot your I's and cross your T's before you really deliver those products. So it's a multi-layered approach, which is deeply integrated with your digital customer experience, is what we suggest to most of our customers. And the merchants that use the best practice approach, they may be able to more effectively either prevent fraud or optimize the risk to friction level with customers, and also lower their cost of fraud. So in the first slide, we talked about the cost of fraud being $3.6 per dollar of fraud. So if the merchants follow a multi-layered approach, which is our best practice, then there is a chance that they might lower their overall cost of fraud. But most of our customers who are serious about optimizing fraud detection to customer friction levels, they use this approach across their customer journey. So the whole diagram that Jen mentioned about, where you're mapping out the customer journey, that's where at all those endpoints, our customers use these approaches. And because they are following these best practices, they tend to experience fewer challenges with identity verification, and it's easier for them to distinguish between legitimate customers and malicious bots. Now, minimizing friction while maximizing fraud protection is a common goal for most of the merchants. And since the fraud occurs in different ways, depending on whether the customer is selling a physical good or a digital good, or if the customer is using the mobile channel, this creates multiple endpoints and ways that fraudsters can attack. These fraudsters will continue to test for the weakest links and where they can operate undetected. So that's what they want. Figure out the weakest link, and they don't want the systems to detect them. So it's important for us to know where the fraudsters have been successful, because those are the gaps that we need to plug. But it's also important for us to know where they tried and they were not successful, for maintaining vigilance. So on the screen, you can see an example of best practices multi-layered approach throughout the customer journey. This includes solutions that verify physical identity attributes or digital identity attributes. And Jen at some point also mentioned behavioral biometrics, which is, are you copying and pasting your own name? Are you copying and pasting your own date of birth? Or are you autofilling the details? Or are you copying and pasting all the attributes? So there are so many different things that can be detected on the screen, which includes how you move your mouse, how you swipe your fingers. So it's important to have access to that kind of information, and where, that really depends on what you want to do. For example, some customers collect this information in the front end and then they're checking for consistency. They're just validating, as Jen mentioned. They validate and then they adjust it regularly and they act accordingly. So it really depends on what your goals are and what your customer journey looks like. But a combination of physical attribute verification, automated transaction scoring, biometrics, digital device risk verification solutions. These are the best practice solutions for optimizing risk to customer friction at any endpoint, whether it's NAO, sign up, or it is a payment use case, or it is a login use case. So we are heavily focused on, if you can see on the screen, digital, physical, and optional authentication. We don't want to authenticate all our users because that creates the most amount of friction. But if we have to, we will have to authenticate them. But before we really make that choice, do we want to look at the assessment that we did based on either the physical identity, meaning their name, their address, their billing address, their shipping address, or the digital identity, which means their device, their email, or maybe their phone number, or maybe the way they're behaving on the device. So depending on the channel, the risk associated with the endpoint or the point of interaction with the customer, and maybe the value of the transaction. So two things: how risky is this transaction, and how valuable in terms of dollars is this transaction, because you could be shipping a $3,000 product. So depending on both those two things, you can make a decision of what order do you want to follow and how do you want to stack these three layers. But in a nutshell, the more layers we use top of the funnel, the less layers we will need at the bottom of the funnel. And our bottom of the funnel transaction is usually the payment transaction where most of the monetization happens. And this is why we highly recommend that if you lock the front doors and the windows, the chances are that the fraudster will not be able to monetize using your platform. So with that, I would request Jen to conclude the session for today.
Awesome. So yeah, we covered a lot. Hopefully this gives you a lot to think about. You know, I think the biggest thing too, while you're going through this journey, is to really be open to a buy versus build approach that can help take the burden off your organization and allow the business to focus on growing the business itself, and lean on the experts in the industry to help funnel in different capabilities to mitigate the various problems that you face on a regular basis. And really important to leverage external signals, which can allow you to enrich your data to more accurately detect good user behavior and make it easier to quickly separate bad behavior. Use all of this to influence things like, how do you manage new versus returning users? Using it to focus on a trust-based strategy, helping to limit friction to your good users and making it difficult for the fraudsters. And again, the playing by your strengths, knowing again what's out there. You know, I think all of us will say, you know, internally we're very capable of building these amazing solutions, but you know, allowing people who are experts on this to do it is much better for your bottom line. I appreciate all the time that everybody spent with us today. We hope you enjoyed our session. happy to answer any questions that are in the chat and connect offline if we're not able to get through everything. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. And thank you, MRC, for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you there to speakers from SIFT, Meta, and LexisNexis. Up next, in 5 minutes, we hear about demarcation of buy now, pay later from Arvato. And we also have the bots panel option, moderated by MRC and with Human Security, Riskified, F5, and Finish Line.